Welcome everybody to the third subchapter, which deals about structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is linked to wage rigidity, which can be defined as the failure of real wages to adjust to a level at which labor supply equals labor demand. In case that unemployment results out of this cause, we call it structural unemployment. And more or less, there are three causes which can lead to wage rigidity and structural unemployment, which is minimum wage laws, a monopoly power of the labor unions, and the phenomenon of efficiency wages. Let's start with an example where wage rigidity plays a role, and wage rigidity will lead to structural unemployment. We'll make a journey and we'll visit Spain. It is the case that we are looking at the menu card of this restaurant, and the menu card is printed. The menu card is printed, which implies that the prices are sticky. The prices cannot be changed in the short run. This is one assumption because goods prices also affect the real wage. The story is as follows. We have one red labor demand curve, which stems from the company, which are demanding labor. And then we have one supply curve, the supply of labor. It is important that we look at the red index, which says demand expected. So we are talking about the expected demand curve. Based on the expected demand, we can fix the nominal as well as the real wage. Like the labor unions are bargaining with respect to the nominal wage, and since the menu card is printed, also the goods prices are set, and hence the nominal wage is fixed, and also the price level is fixed, so that the real wage is fixed at the level A. In case that also the actual demand is equal to the expected demand, then it will not result in unemployment. But now it is the case that we have a negative corona shock. Due to this negative corona shock, the demand for labor is lower than expected. So the demand curve actual is located to the left of the red curve. And at the given real wage, the red real wage, it will be the case that only this amount of labor will be demanded. This amount of labor will actually be demanded while the supply is equal to this level. We have a higher supply compared to demand, and hence this is the amount of unemployment. So we have structural unemployment here because of the fact that the real wage is fixed and the real wage cannot adjust. In theory, there would be two adjustment processes which can lead to a lower real wage. One is a lower nominal wage, and the other is that the prices increase, which will also lead to a lower real wage. We can, of course, in this situation rule out that the prices increase because of the fact that we are in the corona shock. There is no possibility that this kind of shop can increase prices. What about the second adjustment mechanism, a reduction in the nominal wage? Yeah, this depends on the labor bargaining situation, whether it is the owner of the shop who is bargaining with the labor force or whether it's the labor union. In case that labor negotiations take place on a macro level, it is a case that the nominal wages are fixed and the shop owner cannot depart from this nominal wage. The real wage on the level A is too high because the demand is lower, and hence the outcome is unemployment. I would like to come up with another example where the structural unemployment will pop up. We are going to this Yemen fix shop, a Danish shop, and labor supply is equal to 1. We are looking at my daughter. she is working for the real wage, which is equal to 3. What are the components of this real wage? The nominal wage is equal to 90 Danish kroner per hour. The price of an ice cream is 30 Danish kroner per ice cream, so the real wage is 3 ice cream per hour. So my daughter is working for this real wage, like 3 ice creams per hour. But this was a situation before she turned 18. When she's 18, it is the case that the real wage is higher. When she's 18, the real wage is the real wage is equal to 4. Like the nominal wage is equal to 120 Danish kroner per hour. The price is still 30 Danish kroner. So that the real wage at this nominal wage is equal to 4 ice cream per hour. Now we are in this situation here where labor demand is equal to 0, while labor supply is once more equal to 1. Hence, we have here structural unemployment of the size of 1 because of the fact that labor demand is equal to 0 in case that the real wage takes this value here. Hence, we have a second example why structural unemployment can pop up. It's due to the fact that minimum wages play a role in the real economy. So we have to think about where we stand. Is it before one turns 18 or not? Like before one turns 18, one likes this relatively high real wage of 3 ice cream per hour, but like after one turns 18, one gets unemployed. So it depends on which point in time you judge this phenomenon. So we have talked about minimum wages. Let's talk about labor unions. In this model, insiders and outsiders play a role. Insiders are members of the labor force who are employed and are therefore members of the labor union. Outsiders are members of the labor force who are unemployed and therefore not members of the labor union. A labor union like this organization finances itself by the membership fees of the insiders, and insiders are interested in a relatively high real wage. When the bargained real wage is above the equilibrium real wage, it will lead to structural unemployment. Hence, labor unions are creating these outsiders. Labor unions are creating outsiders so that they can please the insiders of the labor market. The third phenomenon, which can lead to structural unemployment, is related to efficiency wages. And there we have several causes or several models which play a role. High wages make workers more productive because they have a better nutrition. Of course, this argument only deals with developing economies. It has nothing to do with industrialized countries. The second example seems to be very interesting because it says high wages reduce worker turnover. And this argument was linked to the Ford company, and the Ford company increased the wage rate from $2.3 for a 9-hour shift to $5 for an 8-hour shift. This had an impact on the turnover rate. The turnover rate decreased from 370% in 1913 towards 16% in 1915. Let's augment the situation a little bit and let's assume that the turnover rate in 1913 was 400%. What does a turnover rate of 400% imply? It implies that the whole workforce is shifted 4 times a year. And this implies that when we start in January with one workforce, this workforce is completely shifted out in the end of March. So a very, very high turnover rate. And this is, of course, incompatible with the idea of Ford to come up with an assembly line. For Ford, it is very important that the turnover rate is low, because then training can take place so that each and every worker gets specialized in this one and only task each worker has to perform in the assembly line. So the decrease of the turnover rate was very important for the Ford company. Of course, when the wages are too high, higher than the equilibrium real wage, then unemployment is the result. Like, you can, of course, imagine that workers were lining up in front of the gates of the Ford company. They also wanted to work for this relatively high wage rate, but they were not let in, so that unemployment is following from this wage increase. Third argument, which can lead to structural unemployment: adverse selection. Good workers go, bad workers stay. The lemons stay in the company. Why is it the case that good workers go? Because good workers, they have good outside options. They find a better paid job outside, while this is not the case for the bad workers. Hence, there is an idea to pay all the workers a very high wage rate, so that also the good workers stay in our company. When this very high wage rate is implemented, of course, it's higher than the equilibrium wage rate, and structural unemployment is the result. Then also moral hazard can play a role, which implies that people change their behavior after the contract is signed. Workers promise to work hard. They make this promise in the job interview, but they are lazy after the wage contract is signed. They are lazy when it comes to work. The idea to solve this moral hazard problem is to make a potential job loss more costly for the employee. How can we do that? First of all, we can increase monitoring, because when we monitor our employees, we have a higher chance to detect misbehavior. And we can also pay our employees higher than necessary, because this makes the job loss more costly for the worker, and hence the worker will not show this lazy behavior, but the worker will be motivated. The next subchapter deals with the labor market in the US, and some empirical evidence is presented. For example, in the first graph, we can see a line diagram, a diagram over time, where we look at the duration of the unemployment. It seems to be the case that in this crisis 2008-2009, the duration of unemployment increased tremendously. Like previously, it was the case that the duration of unemployment, even in a recession, was at the level of 10 weeks. And this increased to the level of 25 weeks. Why? There is a discussion between two economists. On the one hand side, Robert Barrow, and on the other side, Paul Krugman. Barrow argues as follows. The unemployment insurance increased from a duration of 26 weeks to 99 weeks. And this generous unemployment insurance program raised long-term unemployment. Reckless expansion of unemployment insurance was unwise, he argues, economically and politically. What about Paul Krugman? He has a counter-argument. He argues as follows. The problem in 2008-2009 is low consumer demand. And putting money into the pockets of people who badly need it helps to support consumer spending. Krugman argues cutting off benefits to the unemployed will make them even more desperate for work. But they can't take jobs because there aren't any. So, there are two conflicting views on why it is the case that here the duration of unemployment peaked and increased in the time period 2008-2009. In the next step, the following table is presented, which I think is to some extent interesting, because it is the case that here we have a split of the unemployment rate, and we are distinguishing white men and white women to black men and black women. And it is a case that the unemployment rate of the blacks is tremendously higher than the unemployment rate of the whites. Please keep that in mind when there is a discussion in Denmark about the higher unemployment rates of the immigrants. It seems to be the case that also in the US, there is one group which has higher unemployment rates. And here we talk about people which were born in the US, which don't have language problems, which know the American culture, completely different compared to the immigrants in Denmark. Please keep that in mind when you see Danish labor market figures. The next graph shows the labor participation rate, and it is the case that the labor participation rate also declined tremendously after the crisis in 2008-2009. Before the crisis, the labor participation rate was in the range between 66 and 67%, and in 2017, the labor force participation rate decreased to the level of 63%. In order to understand this graph, in a first step, we have to think about how is this labor force participation rate defined? And this graph helps to answer this question. We have a split down of the US population, and it is the case that the total population in the US in the year 2006 was 301 million. Then we have the non-institutional civilian population, which is 228 million. And more or less, this term represents the population in the working age. So some people, of course, they are very old, they are already retired, they are older than 65, and some are kids which are not in the population of the working age. Then we have to think about the civilian labor force, like the labor force, which is equal to 151 million, and the people which are out of labor force, it's 77.4 million. Out of the labor force are, for example, homeless people. Homeless people are out of the labor force because they are not looking actively for a job. Out of the labor force are also the millionaires or the billionaires, which do not offer labor services at the labor market, but they receive their income via dividends or interest. Out of the labor force are also men or women which are staying at home and raising the kids. They are out of the labor force. Then the labor force can be split into the employed and the unemployed. And now we would like to use this graph to compute the labor participation rate. And the labor participation rate is computed as follows: labor force divided by non-institutional civilian population. So the labor force participation rate in the year 2006 was 66.4%. 2006, we are here more or less at 66%. So why is it the case that this labor force participation rate decreased? Let's think about it. It could be the case that we talk about discouraged workers here. Like we know that there was a very big shock in 2008, 2009. And when, for example, somebody loses a job in the US, he loses the home, then he's living in a car. At some point in time, he's losing the car, so he's living in a tent. And then this person cannot actively look for a job anymore, so the labor force participation rate decreases. Is this the main source which is driving this development? No, it's not. Like discouraged workers, they contribute to this development, but the main source is retirement. Like some people are retiring already before they turn 65, and when they are retiring in the age of 60, then it's the case that those people are out of the labor force, and hence labor force participation rate decreases. So this is the main source why the labor force participation rate decreased. The last subchapter deals with the labor market in Europe. And here we can see a clear tendency that the unemployment in Europe increased from the 1960s and the beginning of the 70s tremendously. Like previously, unemployment rates were pretty low at 2%, but then we can see here unemployment rates which are in the range of 10 or even 12%. What has caused this rise in unemployment in Europe? First of all, we have to consider that the demand for skilled workers has increased and the demand for unskilled workers has decreased. In the US, the adjustment took place via the wages. The wages of the unskilled workers fall substantially, while the wage of the skilled workers increased. So, in the US, this shock was digested by an adjustment of the wages, and this is different in Europe. The European welfare states provide unskilled workers with an alternative to work for like low wages. In Europe, we have generous unemployment benefits, and hence this is the alternative for the unskilled workers, and hence this generous unemployment benefits will cause long-term unemployment. The last figure, which is mentioned in this subchapter, is related to the annual hours worked per person. And there we can also see a big difference when we compare the US and Europe. In the US, more or less, the annual hours worked were pretty constant over time, while it decreased in Europe. Why is that? It seems to be the case that the tax system plays a role. When there are higher taxes, of course, you are motivated in the same way to work longer hours because you are thinking about, hey, I'm just paying taxes. Then higher taxes can also lead to a larger shadow economy, black markets, and of course, then you are not working too many hours officially, but you are spending some time in the shadow economy. The role of labor unions was already mentioned. And it might be also the case that there are differences in preferences. The Americans, they like to consume. They get a positive utility from consumption, while in Europe, the people like to have leisure. They get a higher utility when they have more free time. So one cause which might drive this rise in leisure in Europe compared to the US is differences in preferences. This is already the end of chapter 7. Thank you very much for attending this lecture. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.